Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hall of Fame, a podcast by FemFort. My name is Samantha Agasha, and I am your host. Today's episode, we are building on to the conversations that we had last year. We had a conversation previously on feminist movement building. We talked about positive masculinities, and we also talked about what feminist activism looks like in the digital age. So today we have two amazing people that I'm going to let introduce themselves, but we'll be having a conversation on how or what it means to decolonize feminism. So if you haven't checked out our previous episodes, please go to our YouTube, which is FemFort Uganda, subscribe, like, share the previous videos, and also stick around and chill with us in the Hall of Fame.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Mukasa. I regard myself as a feminist, Pan-African feminist activist, and I'm really glad to be here today.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Kemigisa, Jackline. I am also a feminist, I think, these days, but I'm more treading on the captive maternal of late. But yeah, so we're here to discuss decolonization and feminisms, or decolonial feminisms. I think when I got the email from FemFort, I was just thinking of like Tamale's book. And
Absolutely.
for those who are wondering what we're holding, it's copies of Tamale's book. Mine is hideous because it's overused. But yeah, and ridiculously highlighted as well. But I thought that for us to do justice to the topic of decolonization and feminisms, we would have to look at Tamale's work, Professor Tamale's work.
Absolutely. Seminal work. And the title is Decolonization and Afro-Feminism, written by Professor Sylvia Tamale.
Oh yeah, and it's also, you can have a free copy, I think, online.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, but you could also buy
Yes.
a physical copy, support feminists and give your money to feminists. Okay, so when I saw the topic, I thought about like a particular quote, and this is on page 9, and, earlier, but I think for the audience, for purposes of the audience to know what we're talking about, do you mind just reading it out loud?
So we've come up with some we're looking at critical questions posed by Professor Tamale. And the first of them is, how do we divert the paternalistic, fetishized, and poisoned gaze of the Western reader from our beloved continent? That's the first. How do we develop critical consciousness to counter racist, patriarchal, hegemonic power? Who will connect the ideological dots of racism, colonization, capitalism, sexism, and heterosexism in ways that our children understand? And can we move beyond Eurocentric knowledge hegemonies? How do we navigate Eurocentric modernity without losing our Africanness?
Yeah, and I think that that's both like a mouthful, but at the same time, I think that if we're looking at decolonization as, disinvesting from colonial matrices of power and, centering Africanness and African ways of being and African ways of knowing, I think that those questions are very critical to how we do work as feminists, how we approach knowledge production, how we approach even the idea of life in general,
Absolutely.
if we have those foundations around that. But what did you think of the quote?
I mean, I think this is the essential project, right? I mean, it's got both the sort of the consciousness that we need to develop, the lens that we need to develop. It's also telling us the mountain we need to climb, right? Because it's almost a counter consciousness, right? It's really laying down what's been laid out for us as fact, and that we've always, worked with as fact, even though we may have been uncomfortable with it at times. But we've always submerged our discomfort in order to fit in all of these. And I think these are the critical questions we sort of need to ask ourselves. And then it gives us a framework around which, or a roadmap, around which I guess, must think about the kind of organizing that we need to do. It's both how we theorize around it and how we organize around it as well.
And I was thinking about, the question of decolonization, especially given how the Ugandan feminist movement and largely the African feminist movement has organized itself within, and I guess the margins, and I think Tamale also talks about it, like making the distinction between a women's movement and a feminist movement. But I think as funding has progressed over time, and we're talking about, of course, colonization, the Eurocentric gaze, certain aspects of feminisms, of African feminisms have sort of gotten like funding opportunities, and then certain aspects have not necessarily. And so it has also made it a market. Basically, if we're looking at capitalism systems. And I wonder what role you see for us, especially like people who are within that NGO framework, but also people who are organizing in such ways where feminism is now a market. How do you see decolonization happening there?
I mean, I've just read a paper, and I've forgotten the people, I'm really sorry, who wrote it. It's published by Roundtree. And it's critiquing what we call the development industry, which is where all the NGOs and, all of us, people like me, this is where I've cut my teeth, right?
That's where I make my money as well.
This is where, we've made our living and we've struggled. And it's saying that, one, the sort of conflation with the development industry with development is one of the key sort of decolonization themes we have to sort of break, right? Because it places that industry within the context. It's not that large. It's not that big a deal. And there is so much that is going on in and between nations of the South that in a way has overtaken the sort of development industry, in which, we've sort of overemphasized the importance of things like funding and, ideation and, organizing frameworks and so on, which have largely been dominated by the North, which doesn't really give that much. It doesn't really give us that much. And yet it's the entire center of our universe. And they're saying that's a narrative we have to disabuse ourselves of. Because there is a lot that's happening in terms of development, in terms of relations, in terms of trade and all of that. Now, all those are also problematic. But it's saying the South has evolved and has overtaken the development industry, and that the largest part of development support actually comes from the South itself. That's really invisible, and we just keep fixating on these ideas between the North and the South, which has dominated the development industry. And so having said that, I mean, we are at a moment in time, and there is a real, I think, there is a real discomfort now because, between how we organize and the sources of our money, which often dictates what we do, how we see the world and how we analyze the world. But then there are also those who say, look, what about the reparative aspect? Because that money is not from the North. It's housed in the North. It's protected in the North. But there's a whole history about where that wealth was created, which also shouldn't be lost.
That's true, but I think, and this is my hesitation around, first of all, I think I would like to preface, I think I like the topic of decolonization, because decolonization essentially echoes that feminism is everything.
Yes.
In the sense that if you have been colonized, if you're Black, if you're woman, if you're queer,
right.
if you're from the South,
Right.
coloniality of being, whether that's through our education,
Right.
whether
Everything.
it's through like literally everything.
Everything.
How we dress, how we speak, how like it's at the core, it's probably now in the DNA at some point, since trauma can be passed
Generations.
But yeah, I was thinking about especially the conversation around development and decolonization, and for me, I always find it an oxymoron, like to decolonize development and is to abolish the
Yes,
whole system.
the whole notion.
And a couple of my feminist friends will disagree with this, who are in the sector and who are of that you could have certain practices in terms of how you do development that would sort of guarantee or sort of pivot or push it towards decolonization. And I'm just like, no, either way, we have the conversation of reparations, which then brings us maybe to what Walter Rodney was talking about in terms of just like keeping the charge sheet of the balancing sheet of just how much has been lost, calculating it within like the dollar rate or the pound rate, depending on where one is located, and then factoring in like now the role that racial capitalism plays, specifically around extractive industries, around the ways in which nation states, in our example Uganda and other countries, where welfare sectors are not like places of life affirmation, but rather places of disinvestment. And so that fractured relationship between the state, between the human us, between the government, and also between the donors. And I think it would be interesting to see if the development sector in having conversations around decolonization, which cannot happen as well. It cannot happen, but I think in the spirit of conversing and in the spirit of how capitalism does what capitalism does, is to take radical points of thinking and then slap a market value onto them, and then suddenly we have like oxymorons existing as places of study and places of conversation. Decolonizing development, each time I hear it I'm like, what do you mean? Like, how does it work? Like,
yeah. Well, that's a question.
What is it
that we can ask ourselves, and that's why I find the whole sort of conversation around decolonization very interesting. It's about deconstruct everything, right? Deconstruct everything. Deconstruct this sort of unilinear notions about what even development looks like, right? Have conversations about what actually are we talking about when we talk about development. Is it a standard out there that we all must aspire to and kill ourselves until we get there? What about conversations about what works for us in terms of our own vision of development, in terms of how we see the world, how we want to see the world sort of shaped? You guys can do what you want. You guys can do what you want. There's room in this world for everybody. I mean, I think, there is a sort of we all feel discomfort. I mean, these are all heavily loaded terms, right? Development, all of these. They're all deeply, heavily loaded terms because we are sort of working in frameworks that have been set for us by people who colonized us, right? And who are saying that the only way that you can exist and be is if you work to be like us. And we're also finding that they are complete frauds. I mean, it's completely fraudulent. It's not working for the vast majority of people. It's not working for our ecology. It's not working for how we relate to one another as people and as human beings. This notion that you're either like this or you're off track. I mean, that's not working for everybody, right? We're all fighting to conform and we're all living really miserably. So, is there a way we can do it differently? And that's what the excitement of this whole conversation around decolonizing. So it's not just about, redressing those sort of, what did I say? Those crimes that took place in the past, right? But it's about saying, there are different ways of being. There are different ways to be. There are different ways to relate to one another. There are different ways to build markets. There are different ways of coexisting with our ecology that should be exciting all of us right now, right? And then, so we're not always sort of pushing from the back around, hang on, you exploited us and this is terrible. That's an important conversation to have. But it's about saying, actually, maybe let's look at how we, see the world and relate to the world, and let's start putting it into place and let's see what happens. Let them do what they want.
Oh, I like that you talked about the point on different ways of being and different ways of knowing, and I think that also brings us to that bit of like decolonization and the idea of indigeneity, especially around knowledges of the self,
Yes.
knowledges of being, but knowledges of also of doing that are very, I guess, in the sense instrumental to this idea of Africanness.
Yes.
And Africanness, of course, I use Africanness here lightly to mean that we've been socialized around the idea of Africa as Black, and how that Africa as Black and Africa's Black people, we've had a similar experience around colonization, around violence, around nation state building, around the construction of the nation state as a place for exploitation and racial capitalism. And so I guess for purposes of this, when we talk in Africanness, that's what I refer to. I'm not necessarily thinking about like all the multiple variations of the different Africans that we are, or even the different ethnic groups. I'm talking about that centrality of a certain experience that we can all relate to, and how that experience is then politicized to come up with like the different, ideas and stereotypes of what is and isn't Africa. But let's go back to the idea of indigeneity and knowledge. And I guess maybe one more preface is that we were talking about the question of whether Africans can or cannot be indigenous, given the different conversations within like indigenous studies, but also looking at how indigeneity as an identity within the Americas is completely different as not completely different, because I guess the difference is that the colonizer and occupier of the land is still present. And so the contestation around land, around autonomy, around knowledge becomes like very, I guess, stuck in comparison to, say, when we talk about like Africans as indigenous, and someone's like, what do you mean? But you are of the soil. You govern yourselves. And I'm like, no. I don't know if ideally would, because to say that we govern ourselves is to make the assumption that majority of Africans buy into this colonial construction of the nation state, especially borders that require that I need a passport to go to Rwanda, or I need a passport to go to Kenya. Those systems of those architecture infrastructures that are purely racist and colonial, and that have somehow benefited, of course, countries now as marketing units, and we now fall into the whole cooking pot. But back to knowledge, I digress. Back to that idea of indigenous knowledge systems and the role of feminism in Afro-feminism specifically, in trying to center those ways of knowing and being. Are there certain examples that stand out to you that you think within different African feminist movements, or even within your experience, that certain knowledges have sort of retained, or can be retained, or can even be decolonized in the sense of the sort of image making that colonization made out certain knowledges to be?
Wow, that's a tough one, right? So as we know, the sort of coloniality that Tamale talks about is the instruments that have both soft and hard sort of power instruments that have been left in place long after we were sort of handed back these creations and that we were supposed to build as Africans. And they were very deliberate tools, right, of dehumanization, completely obliterating, completely disappearing what it was that we knew, delegitimizing it, and so on and so forth. And there are so many layers. And I know that particularly in sort of feminist knowledge, women's knowledge, a lot of what they did, especially around colonialism, was kept in the colonialist era, was kept secret. Secrecy was a form of resistance, right? A lot of women in these communities derived power from, making what they knew, protecting what they knew, because many of them foresaw what was to be lost. So, for example, in the realm of medicine, but also I think there's a lot happening now in the sort of climate and ecology protection that is delving hard into what women knew. These women were scientists, they were doctors, they were all of these things, right? But a lot of what they knew and a lot of how they protected it and passed it from one to the other, much of that has been lost, right? But I mean, I know, for example, that there are projects that have been working in places like South Africa, Zambia, even here in Uganda, looking at some of the knowledge systems that especially women used around, seed. What do you call it?
The microfinance
Yes.
kind of circle thing?
No. This was long before that. About building, about making climate resistant, seeds, seed exchange, flood resistant, all of these things that women actually did in their societies, protecting grains, storing grains, seed banks, setting up seed banks,
Actually, yeah.
those kinds of things that they did. And of course, that's really important now, because one of the things that we're having to contend with now in the capitalism that we are dealing with now, because capitalism has changed over the years, is this ability to feed ourselves, right? That's also, in serious danger of disappearing. And all of these years, part of our resilience has been that at least we've been able to feed ourselves. Yeah. Once we lose that, that will be goodness knows, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done into finding out these practices that women had around seed, around ecology management, around medicine, plant-based medicine, around, sort of education. But it's not an easy thing, right?
You know, when you were talking about like medicine and certain knowledges, and I remember reading one time, I think it was one of those UN reports around a failed project on reducing the maternal mortality rate, and one of the factors that they named was the distrust that women, pregnant women or people, pregnant people, were, very mistrusting of those sort of systems that they had put in place.
Yes.
And so that the medical facilities sort of were a secondary or a last resort after they have worked with a doula or a midwife from like the very get-go. And this statistic really shocked me, and I guess that also indicates my class. But the statistic was like, what do you mean? How is it that the majority of women do not necessarily use and then you think about like money, you think about sort of treatment, you think about certain attitudes towards, women's bodies that are very inherent throughout like medical systems, or even the disabuse of just people's life
Absolutely.
in how they're handled and cared for, and
Absolutely.
how that is in juxtaposition with this already existing system that has been happening for years and years, and sort of operating in parallel to like modern medicine. And
Okay. So, Jackie, I'm interested to hear. I mean, we started talking about development, and we started talking about the sort of movements and feminist organizing around some of these key issues on decolonization and so on. And I can remember, I'm much older than you are. And when I first started working, we worked within a very sort of human rights lens, where it was about acquiring sort of rights, legal rights largely. And these were largely molded within the sort of civil and political rights framework. And of course, what we've had with the sort of push from the South especially is this sort of blowing out of the water these notions. And Dr. Tamale, Professor Tamale talks about it very clearly in her book about rights and justice, for example. There is a lot more concentration now on notions such as capitalism within the conversations of feminism, but also of decolonization. So can you just help us construct what some of those arguments are and how you see them in terms of, what are the
so I think specifically within like feminisms, I know there's a lot of like conversation around economic justice, understanding placement of women within labor, and those conversations around labor politics, which labor is valued. And I think maybe what capitalism does is just simply assigns value to something. And so in that system, if we look at specifically, patriarchal capitalism, where masculinity and maleness is the epitome of humanness, and that then is assigned a value that
whiteness,
equals, and whiteness, of course. Whiteness is the epitome of humanness. Then white women then become the opposite of that. Then the rest of us are like black tea black. We are then damned in the Fanonian sense. But yeah, so I think within various feminisms now, there's the conversations around like economic justice and finding women's place. But I think for me, my contestation with such conversations is that it's still rooted around this idea of a right. And the idea that we derive rights from somewhere, and how rights are then tied into like the legal systems. And if we look at, the context of Uganda or the context of any African country that attained nationality out of that violence that happened, I think even then when you look at, and of course Tamale does a really brilliant job in looking at the legal system and the duality of that, and just goes extensively to break down how frameworks around human rights, or whether it's economic justice rights, that language is very foreign and very inapplicable. So I think it also comes from the place that the contestation is your humanness, which again, if you look through these white supremacists in what Bell Hooks calls white supremacists, cis hetero patriarchy and capitalism, you can understand that the language and that framing of rights can make sense to certain individuals. But here, when you use the language, and again going back to that idea of knowledges and I like what Professor Tamale here does with Ubuntu, and not necessarily in how it's been whitewashed, pun intended, but how it's been whitewashed and used. But I think that Professor Tamale uses Ubuntu as a radical philosophy of race. In the sense that I derive my humanness from you. And so if you are a human and I see you, that means I am human, because and so with that framework and that knowledge and that way of being and knowing and doing, it becomes a little bit weird now when we bring the concepts around human rights. Because that contestation of the category human and right, I'm just like, what do you mean if
Which right? That right as opposed
Yeah.
to that right?
But then again, I think that when we look at how, then Afrofeminism comes into place, and it's also saying that it's not saying that we're not unaware of our placements within globalization, within modernity, but rather within that place, within that placement, we also seek to sort of recognize, but also reconcile, I guess, repair, structure, ways of being and knowing that are very that we sort of, I guess, we sort of know, because it's very hard to define something that you leave. And I find that a lot of if you know it, you feel it, that it goes to other senses outside of sight and definition, that is very like Eurocentric ways of knowing and doing. And and so I think that idea, and again, going back to where feminism is and where we are at within Afro-feminism, it also links back to what is funded and what isn't funded. And now economic justice is a very big thing, and we have forums, no hate to anyone who has sat on those forums, but economic justice forums, which rightly so will be discussing issues around like wage labor and the place of woman within the capitalism and within neoliberalism, but also taking it a little further into critiquing ideas around the nation state that certain sectors have been feminized, like education, health, that are very central to the well-being, agriculture, but yet at the same time these are also sectors that are so largely women-led and held. And I think within Uganda it's even ironic that it's that women-held and women-led is also reflective of our politics. Like if you look at the ministries and who has been
the care
assigned, who is in health, who's in education, largely they're women, and that in a way is reflective of that. So I think the different feminist movements where we are at, specifically around issues on economics, issues around an analysis of capitalism. And one thing that I think for me stands out is the feminist organizing that is not necessarily under the NGO structure is having sort of different debates around that. So we, for example, Kenyan feminists and Ethiopian feminists, and actually Sudanese feminists as well, have been, even Uganda to a certain extent, have been really good at mutual aid. Especially, in taking away the ideas like around capitalism, where capitalism as a system teaches you to be embarrassed about your financial state, or even these, or even decentering and deconstructing these ideas that we all have financial literacy. Like you can only have financial literacy if you have finances, and that very condescension, that very condescension that women should be taught how to use money, yet inherently as women who earn less and who majority of the care work falls onto them, they know how to use money, because that literacy is very much integral to your everyday experiences. So I think online and maybe in other feminist spaces that I haven't been privy to, conversations around mutual aid or mutualness around how we give money politics as well, where you're placed, where you're located, how you come into rooms, and how you share those resources. Those conversations are actively going on, or even in other instances. I know in the Ugandan sense, it's largely what's it called? Fundraising for health, something like car washes, and of course, they're never like stationed within this systemic debate, because to fundraise for someone's healthcare is largely to also critique the fact that you have a nation state and a government that has failed. Now, the two were never linked, but I guess we can't take the practice away from like the system, and that practice is in direct response to a failure in that system, but also reflective of certain knowledges, certain ways of being, and certain ways of humanity. That if you're sick and you don't have access to you cannot pay your medical bills, someone else can come in and chip in. And I think collectively we do practice that. And largely I think in that practice is also decentering capitalist systems, but also centering certain ways of being and knowing. And I think that's one way that I see it happening.
That's interesting, because I think it was Toni Morrison who said, the white supremacists is exhausting. It gets you chasing all kinds of things except for what you should be doing, right? And I think and I think it's largely true. You know, we find ourselves splitting our energies and being pulled in all kinds of directions. I remember working and thinking, okay, because we were called women's rights, and I apologize. Because we were women's rights, we were supposed to know what women's rights are in every single situation, you know? You know, if it's conflict in DRC, if it's conflict in Ukraine, if it's, you know, that kind of thing. And you're right, for me, a really critical piece about the whole decolonization conversation is the economic piece, which is one that really isn't. It's a dangerous one. You start talking about it and everybody gets nervous in the room, right? And so, yes, there was that critique about what was being done in the development circles was not actually a transformatory agenda. It was an agenda, you know, what you're talking about, the labor rights, the so on and so forth, was very much about, again, fitting women and gender expansive people and excluded communities into inherently unjust systems.
That's true.
And just making life a little bit easier for everybody and easing everybody's guilt. But then the question, you know, came, okay, fine. Then if we don't do this, because especially under COVID and things like that, and especially with the sort of neoliberal agenda, which has changed capitalism into even a much scarier prospect, actually. When we dropped that responsibility, but then especially as neoliberalism, as difficult as the relationship was between state and people, what they did in the 50s, after the Second World War, was build a consensus to say, actually, if we don't tame capitalism, we're going to lose everything, because the Soviet Union, all of these things. So they did bring in that welfare state. And a lot of the gains in the welfare state were there for women, because the state then took on the roles that were traditionally assigned to women: caring for the sick, educating, you know, all of that stuff. But now we've got to a point where the state isn't even responsible for that anymore, doesn't even have to aspire to that anymore, right? And we're at that moment now, and we can see what the cost is, right? For the very constituencies that we're concerned about. The responsibility for that lies on the backs of women. Indigenous people are thrown off their land to create yet more markets. You know, it's all crazy. It's all crazy, right? So there were feminists organizing to maybe plug the gaps, who really thought they were decolonizing. And then there are other feminists who are offering ideas of alternatives, but they're largely, you know, sort of on the margins. So the question I'm asking is, okay, there's a whole conscientization piece of work, but then there is also the imperative to say, look, these are some of the alternatives that we can use and that are working as part of that sort of knowledge building system. Are you seeing that being organized in any sort of meaningful way, or is there some reticence around that, given how we know that all of these things can then be swallowed up and just sort of, how do you see that?
I think the evolution feminists have like an interesting framework for that, where they advocate for specifically, you know, all of us finding something that we're good at and then contributing. And so in that essence, that the people who are more interested in, okay, how do we find alternatives, or how do we, you know, structure, or how do we rethink these systems, or how do we patch up the systems, do that work, because that's where they're best suited, and we also need energy there. But I think it's Joy James who says that a Trojan horse can go both ways in defense of that very thing.
Yes.
Because they were talking about how you know, that push and pull, where we're like, okay, maybe disinvest. I'm on the team disinvest. I think my idea of decolonization in within Uganda and within African feminisms would be an abolition of the nation state. That would be my idea.
Okay.
So in the case of Uganda, it would be abolish Uganda.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be my start. Let's start with the very construction, or with the very framing that, or with the very infrastructure that holds all these anti-Black systems together. Whether it's our education that teaches you advantages of colonization, whether it is the legal system that, you know, sort of creates, you know, binaries around criminal law and whatever commercial law, or it, you know, or it's the essentially the concepts, how we work with the land, how we deal with the land, or it's knowledge management. I think for me that the thing that holds all of it together is the nation state, because it lays down an infrastructure that we follow, find ourselves breathing and living and being. But I guess back to the quote on Joy James where she was like, the Trojan horse can go both ways. And it was, though the context was in relationship to the role that violence can play in, because they're doing an analysis
it's essential.
on what else can they were doing an analysis talking about how feminism, specifically white feminism and Black feminism and Afro-feminism, sort of shies away from the use of violence as a liberatory tool, and yet that's the experience. And so their contestation was that, how do we talk about violence as a tool, as a liberatory tool, or as an analytical tool of understanding the oppressor, without necessarily feeling or shying away or feeling like, oh, now we're asking women to fight. But so when they say that the Trojan horse can go both ways, I think it's the same way, in the sense that certain alternatives or certain conversations, first of all, have to be held for certain progress to happen. You know, in a way, it's easier to burn everything down and rebuild, which I would call for. But at the same time, I understand that in the material sense, and the sort of stakes that other women, whether it's women who have had children, or women who are mothers, or women who are aunties, or women who are sisters, or women who are very tied to this conceptualization of kinhood or familyhood, certain extreme stakes, they do not necessarily see a foreseeable future in that way. So in that sense, then abolition feminism comes in to say, you know, play your part where you are, play really well, because we all contribute something to this, you know, collective liberation of all of us. And if your role is we're at a certain point in life, and my access is to, you know, now with Palestine, we've seen that the UN is now not a thing that works. But in our instances, say if you are in certain rooms and your role was to do maybe policy analysis, what does that look like when you have like a women-centered agenda? You know. And I think I'm wary of the slap agenda lens on anything, and you know, fix women in there. I'm like, no, sometimes you don't need to fix women in there, because those are places of violence. And I don't know why it's a feminist practice to bring violence into women. It's in fact anti-feminist to do so. So I'm like, you know what, some tables, we don't have to be there. You know, if the table was constructed without you in mind, it's built to exclude you.
Yes.
So how
construct your own table.
Yeah, not even construct, but organize on the margins. And I think that most women, especially African women, our understanding of the margins is where we reside. That's where you find the knowledges. You know, if you're within a patriarchal culture where certain spaces are male-dominated spaces, you find the other knowledge in kitchens. You find it in the backyard. You find it in pots. So women drinking over something. And I think, you know, nurturing those spaces that life affirm outside of using that white lens of, you know, human rights and inserting women and gender minorities into those spaces that are just violent. I think it visits a violence upon, you know, women. And when people say, like, or when I think about like what's the price for it, I honestly cannot do like the balancing sheet and say that was price worthy, you know. But like, oh, first woman to do so and so, and I'm just like, oh my god,
what she must the price she must have paid.
Give her money, whatever it is she needs, give it to her, because I think that the price.
That's a really interesting notion, right? Because yeah, I mean, a lot of what the feminist organizing, even in Africa, has been trying to do is bring women to the center of things.
Well, what has it done for us?
Women have to be at the center.
You know, if women are at the center, let's say, for example, at the center of PowerPoints, I also think that also sort of.
Well, the argument is they've been on the margins for too long, you know, unrecognized, and you know everything. You know, what they know doesn't matter. Everything doesn't matter. You know, what they do, what they contribute, all of that doesn't matter. And it's because they've been assigned to the margins and everybody else has been sitting on them, which is also a form of violence, right?
It is a form of violence. But I think, though, that picking and choosing where to pour nurturing energy. So I can imagine if the funding that has gone into having women in certain UN spaces or in certain places went to the actual material well-being of the women as well, you know, what that would do. Because again, the same system of violence is also a very capitalist system. It's also a system of othering. And so then it creates also within movements, I think it also largely fractures within movements because that collectivity is then overtaken with certain, you know, who is where and who is what. And I think also it's a resource heavy work.
Yes, it is.
So I'm just like, no, take that money and give it to the women's circles and see amazing things happen. And see how women take agency and remove themselves or even construct whole different tables. And so for me, it's a power and a money dynamic. And I think we're coming up on our assigned time. So I want you to, I guess, what does decolonization mean to you in practice? If we were to tell the audience, you know, one of the ways you practice decolonization or decolonization feminism, what would that be?
No, I mean, decolonization really means, for me, liberation, freedom. I'm going to say permission to be, but I don't mean it in that way. I mean, of course, I give myself permission to be, but I find community with others, and I find pride with others. And one of the ways that I've tried to do this is really building knowledge about who my ancestors were, my feminist ancestors, who these were, right? Because largely we don't know about them. And it's been so amazing finding out about the rich heritage of feminist organizing wherever Africans find themselves. I was in Brazil just 2 years ago, and I went on a tour in Rio de Janeiro, where the first African slaves ships arrived. And there were these whole history of African enslaved women, organized and did cooking, because of course it was a very busy port, you know, and a lot of commerce was going on there. So all of these enslaved women got themselves together, used to cook and sell, just exactly what you're saying, cook and sell, and through that they bought the freedom of other enslaved peoples and set up towns and there's just a rich tradition. All of this that I just find so, you know, of resistance, of community, of solidarity, of just ingenuity. I mean, you know, imagine doing that in that kind of context. So for me, it's one of the ways that I've really tried to do that is try and sort of find out who my ancestors were, find out our histories, and share that with people, younger people, for not even younger, but people, share it with everybody, because many younger people know far more than I do, right? But share it with people, because you just realize that, oh my gosh, I didn't know, we didn't know. And you just see the change in somebody's demeanor, you know. And of course, you know, just trying to keep busy within the sort of feminist thinking circles. How about yourself?
I think for me, it's honestly disinvesting from nation states and disinvest and more into community. So I think for me, it's been actively finding community and building community and getting a buy-in from different communities across generations, across continents, across. And so it's finding, you know, elders in Brazil, elders in London, elders in Kampala, elders in Kigali, and just,
Excellent.
pooling those places that, nurture me, but also places that I can also be able to give, because I've found that
Absolutely.
in my previous work, trying to decenter or even talk about deconstructing certain systemic things has been such a draining experience.
It is.
And the backlash has been tenfold. So I was like, no, it's not really life affirming, because the system was built to do what it does. And so rather than, challenge a thing that is working just right, pour the same energy into, different women groups. And so that, for me, that means, either I'm teaching, depending on where I am, or pouring less finances, but pouring into the communities that I am a part of, outside of trying to say this and this. I'm just like, no, I don't have the energy.
Absolutely.
I don't have the
It's
energy.
wonderful.
But yeah, I guess that wraps up our time.
Conversation.
So, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
It was lovely.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation. It's lovely to see you as well.
It's lovely to see you.
Yeah, and for the audience, we hope you find something that you enjoy, or something that sparks your joy. Yeah.
Thank you.